During my stay in Newry, my brothers and sisters finished their education in Newcastle, and they, along with my parents, moved to the city of Belfast. Soon I joined them there. I had the intention of continuing in the college, the technical college, but I found the Lord had something else in mind for me. One of the elders in the assembly in which we were in fellowship was a real young man's man. Upon arriving there, he invited me to join him along with a few other young men, including T. Ernest Wilson. I was invited to his home along with a few more. When we arrived there, we had a time of prayer. After prayer, Mrs. Patterson, this dear man's wife, had a hot cup of tea with lots of nice little things to eat. After that, well, we went out and found a place in Sandy Row where we could preach the gospel in the open air. Soon we were all engaged in that kind of work. We spent much time also in attending football fields or race tracks, wherever a company of people would be gathered. We had, of course, a good supply of ammunition with us, gospel tracts. And as those dear people left the football field or other place of amusement, we distributed these tracts amongst them. On Saturdays, we also were busy. We went to various villages and towns around us. After distributing the gospel tracts, we generally had an open-air meeting. Some of these places were out of the way, but that's where the gospel had to be taken. On one occasion, Ernie Wilson and I were alone. It was a very wet, stormy night. Very few people were out, but somehow we decided that we would preach the gospel at a certain place. This we did. We could only see one man with his overcoat tucked around his neck. He was standing in the shelter of a public house, that is, a place where drink was sold. After preaching there for some time that evening, with the rain pouring down, we went home and forgot all about it. Years afterwards, perhaps 25 or 30 years, a man stopped Ernest on the road, asking him if he were Ernest Wilson. He said, yes. Do you remember preaching the gospel one night along with another young man, he said, in a certain place? Yes, Ernest said. Do you remember a man standing there listening? Yes. Well, I'm that man. I never forgot what you said that night until God saved me, and now I'm in fellowship in one of the assemblies here. Ernest told me this years afterwards, and of course it made our hearts joyful to think that in some little measure at least, God had used that effort that we had put forth in our young days. Father's health was still a problem, and I also had a sick brother and sister. Father had a brother and sister who lived for many years in California. They kept writing him to go there, as they thought the climate would suit him much better. So in 1921, we all left Ireland for sunny California. That was a journey of 2 weeks or more. 1 week on the boat to New York. There we had the joy of seeing an aunt who had been living there for some time. Then over 1 week on the train. Mother made our food on the train, which consisted generally of sandwiches and tea. My job was buying the food as we passed through the towns on our way. Sometimes I almost missed the train, but I was always able to make it. Arriving in Los Angeles, we were met by Father's sister, who kindly took us to her home and gave us a space to sleep until we found a house to rent. In 2 days, my brother and I found work. And little over a week, we were living in our own rented house. My other brother, Hugh, had to keep to bed. The pain in his back was so painful. Some suggested a chiropractic doctor, but that only made him worse. And another doctor put him in a cast where he lay for some considerable time. Finally, a nurse that Father knew years ago back in Ireland passed through Los Angeles. Father invited her to the home. When she saw Hugh, she suggested that he should see her doctor. Arrangements were made, and Hugh was taken to the hospital. The doctor was able to perform a slight operation in his back and suggested that he lie in bed for 2 weeks. Then he would come to see him. At the end of 2 weeks, the doctor came, examined him, and pronounced him cured. But he would have to learn to walk again. He instructed my father and myself what to do to help him. And in 2 weeks' time, right enough, there he was, walking as straight and perfect as any of the rest. My sister also found work. That is, my sister who was healthy, while our other sister remained at home and helped in the house. However, my sister at work took ill, and after some considerable time had to go to Olive View Hospital. There she was treated. Her lungs had to be filleted and sandbags put on her chest. But after some time, she was operated on. In fact, she spent several years having operations in that hospital. Finally, one night, we were called to her bedside. She was not responding from one operation that she had. The doctors thought there was little hope. They were reopening the wound to see if they could find anything. Yes, they found something. Something that had been accidentally left in after the operation. Removing that object, my sister remained in bed for some time, very sick indeed. Eventually she improved. She improved so much that soon she was able to come home. Aged 6 months she was examined, always negative. She did not have to return to the hospital again, but was able to keep at home without doing any work. So there we were, in that condition. Then my other sister found a job. She seemed to be better in health. And she was then the main support of the family in many ways. I, of course, had been thinking of many things. However, one thing would always remain with me. That was, I felt the Lord's call to go and sound forth the wondrous story of the Lord Jesus Christ to the lost and perishing. So pretty soon the way opened up. I had been distributing tracts round our locality. Gospel meetings were started by my father, whose health, I might say, had been much improved. In fact, the climate seemed to agree with him, and he was able to work a tent again. The tent was pitched in several places in and around Los Angeles. On one occasion, he joined up with Mr. William J. McClure, and they had meetings in York Boulevard. There I helped all I could. My work was from 7 in the morning to 3:30. I would come directly to York Boulevard vicinity at 3:30 after work, where I distributed invitations and gospel tracts. I helped in the meetings in every way I could. And pretty soon I had quite a number of children in the tent having a Sunday school on Sundays while the tent was there. Later on, an assembly was formed in that part. I was also attracted to the Mexicans. Passing through their district after arriving in Los Angeles, I inquired who they were. They seemed to me to be very poor, living in old shacks, partly made of wood, wooden boxes, old tins, and a little canvas. I was told who they were, and eventually I made my way back, having received some good gospel tracts in Spanish. Of course, Spanish was their language. So I got in to know the children on the streets. I got little verses made, John 3 and 16, and many more. Gave them these slips of paper with the gospel verse written on it. If they repeated that verse, when I returned the following week, I gave them a little prize. At the same time, I was distributing some New Testaments, which the Bible House of Los Angeles had on sale at half price. Other young folks in the assembly got to know what I was doing. They helped in many ways by prayer, by writing out the text in English on slips of paper, and also by buying some New Testaments. I kept this up, and then at last I rented a house for $40 a month. I also, of course, had to help at home, where I had a sick brother as yet and a sick sister. So there was not so much money left after paying the rent of this extra house that I rented for the Mexican children. However, it was very interesting work. But soon it was rather rough. Some big boys would come and disturb the meetings. The parents wouldn't allow their children to go home alone, so I had to take them home after the meeting. Finally, I rented another place in another part of the Mexican district. This part seemed to be a little quieter, and there I had up to 75 to near 100 children. I went out every week and had a service for them. During the week, I would also go out to that district and distribute gospels and gospel tracts in the homes of the people. Pretty soon they got to know me. They got more confidence, and they sent their children to the little school which I had for them. Then, about that time, Father and Mr. Dempsey had gospel meetings in a tent which they pitched in Central Avenue. I was at the door, of course, and one night, after all the people had congregated inside, no one else was coming, I went to the street distributing tracts and inviting the people to come in. One man I asked to come, he said yes, he was going. His wife had been there the night before, and now it was his turn. That dear man eventually received Christ as a Savior. So did his wife and her sister. His name was Adam Trophy. Now, as time went on, Adam began to find out that I was occupied in the Mexican district. He wanted to know if he could come too. Of course you can, I said. In fact, it was rather difficult to get any help at all. All the young people seemed to be very busy. They seemed to have so much to do. There was no time for such a thing. Although I must say, some of them did. Some came along at times and gave a wonderful help. One of those dear young men was a boy by the name of Tyler. Yes, he came out and helped. Others came too, at times, but there was no one permanent to help. However, this dear man, Adam Trophy, and his wife and her sister came out and took quite an interest in those dear people. We had found a better place to have the meetings in, rented that. And they practically took full charge, for which I was very thankful. At the same time, I was busy distributing gospel tracts in other parts of the Mexican district. That was about the time I began to get more and more exercised about those dear people, and had thought of going down to Mexico, where indeed there was a great need. However, hearing about the need in Guatemala, well, that's where we eventually went. I might say that during my time working amongst the Mexicans, I was receiving gospel tracts. I was receiving Las Buenas Nuevas, the good news. I was also receiving mensajes del amor de Dios. These mensajes del amor de Dios were sent from Pasadena. Now then, a young lady came to live in Pasadena. She came from Scotland. She had been for some little time in Canada. Then she was in other parts and in Cleveland. The way opened up for her to come to Los Angeles. And she naturally looked up the assembly in Los Angeles. However, she lived beside these dear Christians who sent out mensajes del amor de Dios. Eventually, one of these dear sisters asked her if she knew a young man by the name of Ruddock, who went to her assembly. She said, yes. Would you please ask him to come out and see me? I've been sending him these packages of gospel tracts for the Mexicans for some time, and I would like to hear how he is doing and what he is doing amongst those people. So then that message was delivered, and I was very happy indeed to go out to see Miss Ulrich. That was the sister who was occupied in such a work, along with her sister, Mrs. Kinsman. So, of course, I went out, and this young lady was there too by the name of Nettie Baird. We had much in common. I gave a description of the work we were doing, and I might say that this young lady took a very, very much interest in the account. And then she too came out to the Mexican district to help. And our thoughts were both going further afield. She too knew that the Lord had been calling her, which she thought, down to South America somewhere. However, my mind was in Mexico, but we divided it up and went eventually to Central America. Yes, we were commended to the work from Los Angeles. Now I might say that before we went to Guatemala, we were united in marriage. The marriage took place in Pasadena. And after the marriage, we went on a honeymoon trip. We went by train up to San Francisco and Oakland. There we visited the assemblies there. And we went on to Seattle and Portland and further on up into Canada. We had a wonderful time. And as we went, we visited the assemblies, telling them about the work that we had been doing and what was on our thoughts, and told them that the way seemed to be opening up for us to go to Guatemala. We also went over to Vancouver Island, and we visited the most of the assemblies on Vancouver Island. After having visited all the assemblies there, we returned back home to Los Angeles again. After coming home, I gave notice in the place in which I was working that I would be leaving sometime soon. However, before that, they had approached me and wanted to give me a better job. There was an opening for a man that was needed to take on much responsibility. And I was the man that wanted to give the work to. However, I would need to study a little more. And for that, they had made provision. They were going to send me to school again, to college. And I would study, and then I would be in a condition to take this work. I did not care for that, of course. But I must say that it was indeed quite a fight. I would have a very, very good job indeed. I would have a good salary. And they brought out what I could do with the money. I could have a nice home, a nice house, well furnished, and I'd be well taken care of in after life. However, the man that they sent to see me, to tell me all this, his name was Mr. Worldly. Now, when he was introduced to me as Mr. Worldly, I began to think, worldly, worldly. Where have I heard that name before? Well, then I remembered it was in Pilgrim's Progress. That's where you find a gentleman by the name of Mr. Worldly. That, of course, put me on my guard at once. Had it not been that his name was Mr. Worldly, I might have had a more difficult time. But seeing that's what his name was, I couldn't mistake it. I had to make a choice between the world and God. What God was wanting me to do and what the world would have me to do. So I told this dear man, after he had spoken to me for some considerable time, that it was hopeless, that I had already made up my mind what my life's work was be. And I did not want to deceive the company for which I was working. If I would go to school, if I would learn, it would only be for a short time. I would not be able to continue. So therefore, it would be much better if they could look for someone who would be able to give all their time, their energies and thought to the work which had to be done. Very reluctantly they gave in. And of course then I was left free. Yes, I was left free. Free to think very seriously indeed. The experiences of years gone by came before me. Yes, I brought some of those experiences to your notice before. One I think I left out. I stood upon the mountain top and scanned the wide world o'er. I saw all ruin in the fall, rush on to hell's dark door. Then I've got the message, I must go, else Jonah's doom befall me. So keep me not, I pray thee no, for God himself hath called me. Yes, those experiences came back to me in a way that gripped my soul. I couldn't get away from them. There was no escape from them. They had to be faced. And now that I had gained the victory over Mr. Worldly and all the rest, now I felt freer. I felt at liberty. And of course, serious thoughts filled my mind. We had thought of this seriously, both Nettie and I, for some time. We approached the brethren, the elders of the local assembly, told them what was on our hearts, and they listened very attentively indeed. They gave us some good advice. Later on, they would see about it. This they did. And one memorable night, I had been invited to go to York Boulevard. That's the place that I had spent so much time in days gone by. We went there, and the assembly there, along with Jefferson Street Assembly, listened very attentively to the words that I had to say, and to how that I had been convinced the Lord had been calling me to fields beyond. In some time after that, they informed me that everything, as far as they were concerned, was all in order. They had looked into our lives. They could find nothing that would hinder our going, and they very kindly gave us a letter of commendation to work in Central America for the Lord. Of course, we had to prepare. Well, it took a little time for that. And then in the month of November, if I'm not mistaken, we set sail from Wilmington down the coast and on past Mexico and down into Guatemala. There we were met by one whom we had been in correspondence with. He kindly took us then to where he lived in Quetzaltenango. There we commenced in reality to learn the language and to get down to business. We spent some 3 or almost 4 years there, but they were very difficult years indeed. We had to come through many things. No doubt the Lord was teaching us lessons that would be useful in the future. It wasn't a very pleasant man that we had to deal with in many ways. And of course that gave us some course of thought. However, we weren't very long there until we were able to give messages in Spanish. And then we were able to get further afield. However, the headaches that I had always been troubled with from my youth up, the migraine headaches, were giving too much trouble. And I remember one day as I was out and I was distributing tracts in a little village not very far away from where we lived in San Felipe on the coast at that time. And I was so sick and the pain was so much, I lay down on the pathway. And as I lay there on the pathway, I heard a noise. I looked up and I saw a big stone coming down the cliff, coming right into where I was. I had time to jump and nothing more. I jumped from the place where I was lying, and how I did it I cannot tell. But I jumped about 3 feet all at once, my body and all lying on my back. Just as I got over, the big stone came down on the place in which I had been lying. That to me was very impressive. I began to think of it and thought that I'd better take the doctor's advice and go away for a time so that I could get my health restored once more and try and get relief from my headaches. This we did, and we made arrangements and set sail for Scotland. It was a memorable journey. It took us 4 weeks to go. It was by boat. It was very restful indeed. The weather was something wonderful all the way. We called in Limon, Costa Rica. We went on then to Panama Canal, and we had the privilege of going and seeing the canal. The American Bible Society had their headquarters for Central and South America there at that time. So we were able to visit those with whom we had communication during our time in Guatemala, as they were those who supplied the Bibles. So we had a nice time there. Went on to Venezuela, and there we had the joy of meeting with Mr. Johnson. He entertained us for the day, and then we went off on the boat again. We went to Trinidad, and there we had a happy time there. The boat had to cool up in that place, and when we got to the docking point, we heard our name called out. Someone on a little boat looking for us. It was some of our missionaries there. So they came to take us, and we went with them for the night and spent the next day with them, looking around the island, hearing of the wonderful things that the Lord was doing in that place. Eventually we came back in the evening and we were refreshed. The other poor passengers had to stay on the boat, and they were loading coal. The coal dust wasn't very pleasant, but we escaped that. Then we went on our trip again, and eventually we arrived in Plymouth, England. Now I had heard of the Plymouth Brethren, and there was one who was very active in looking after missionaries who passed through. I looked for him but could hardly find him. At last I was told that I'd find him on the top of a big building. I went there, and right enough he was at the top, but he was busy. The only way to see him was go up the ladder. So I went up the 60-foot ladder. Now in my youth I was used in heights, so that didn't trouble me very much. But I must confess it was a strange feeling when I got 3/4 way up. However, I got up there, and there, long at last, I met one of the famous Plymouth Brethren. That was the first time in my life that I had the privilege of doing so. We had a nice chat together, and then it was time for me to go. So we went, got on the boat again, continued our journey, and on we went to England. Getting off the boat, we had to wait a little time for the train, and we were advised that we could have a lunch on the train if we put in our order. We put in the order, and they were to give us a basket lunch at a certain place. Upon arrival at that place, the basket lunch was there. The basket was all right, the food was all right, but the money wasn't all right. Now, the only thing that we had of money was a 10-shilling gold piece, and I offered that for our food. However, the boy wouldn't take it. He looked at it. He didn't seem to know what it was. Well, I said, that's strange. This is a 10-shilling English piece, gold piece. Well, he didn't know it. The fact was, gold was out at that time, and the poor boy hadn't seen such a thing before. But that's all the money we had. So, however, as long as it lasted, he took that and went off. That left us, of course, without anything. However, when we got to Glasgow in the train, there were friends there who kindly took us and took us to our home. Nettie, of course, was delighted. Her mother was there, her father was there, and her sisters were there. She did not have any brothers. However, as she was told afterwards, her mother said she would not have known her had she not known that she was coming. Yes, those years in Guatemala had taken effect, and indeed we were both very, very weary and run down in health. And of course, there was more bones than flesh, so no wonder she hardly knew her own daughter. A short time in Scotland, however, revived us both, and pretty soon we are well on our feet again. The headaches, although they still troubled me, didn't trouble me so much. And Nettie began to be rather famous around those parts. During the stay in Guatemala, although it was very tiring, very many unpleasant things, at the same time, the Lord was able to help her in many ways. And she became famous as one who was able to take away tapeworms. Now, tapeworms were something at that time in Guatemala that troubled many, many people. And it was a rare thing to get them cured completely. However, Nettie began to study the situation, and her father was able to send her some special medicine from Scotland. This medicine had the effect of taking the tapeworm right away, head, tail, and everything else. Some of these worms, which she took away, were very many yards in length. In fact, it's hard to believe that there was such a thing in the human body. But she got rather famous for that. So at home, as she traveled around, and she was asked to tell her experience in many places. And she became rather famous as a speaker, and she was very popular indeed. Of course, I too had made arrangements and had gone over to Ireland. There I spent a very short time. There was a conference on, and of course I was invited to speak at the conference. I spoke along with Ernie Wilson, my old companion. He had been out to Central Africa and had quite an experience there. The Lord blessing his word that went forth, and many souls were saved. And he had quite a story to tell. And of course, he and I got along splendid. We had a good time together. And as I went around, telling the dear people there was to be done yet in Central America, quite an interest was stirred up. Pretty soon Nettie joined me there, and we had a wonderful time together. Well, every house we visited, of course, had to have a cup of tea and an egg and some other nice dainties to eat, until Nettie couldn't stand it any longer. And it was indeed some sight to see then at 10 o'clock at night, when we thought everything was over, then again we were invited to go for that last evening and see some more friends and some more Christians. So we had a very happy time there indeed.